people can, I'm going to go ahead and get started as people continue to filter in. Welcome for those of you in attendance. Our webinar, Emerging from COVID-19. Before we get into the meat of it, just a few quick housekeeping items. We've muted the lines for audio quality today. That said, we're eager to take questions as you go through. You'll notice there's a Q&A functionality. I'd encourage you, as you've got questions, to ask those. We'll get to as many of those as time permits, and for those where time may not permit, we'll make sure to follow up with you. Second, we will be providing both copies of these slides as well as a link to the recording, assuming all things technically go well. So don't feel like you need to scribble every word down. You'll get an opportunity to see and experience today's presentation again, or share with others to the extent that may be useful. I wanted to introduce the team that'll be talking with you today. My name's Eric Daly. I'm one of the principals at Multnomah Group. I'm joined today by three of the most important people within the organization. They head up the various service committees within the organization. Haley McLaughlin, SEMA, who heads up our Vendor Services Committee, so the group that does the work to evaluate not only the 24 providers that our clients currently work with, but other providers in the marketplace that could be providing record-keeping administration services. David Williams, CFA, who heads up our investment committee and team, including the research effort. And then Greg Johnson, JD, who heads up our technical services committee. So the group that is charged with helping our clients understand, interpret, and take action relative what's happening in a guidance perspective and regulatory environment from the Department of Labor, IRS, and Congress. Before we get into today's presentation, maybe talk a little bit about what we're trying to accomplish. As you've noted, none of the folks on today's call are healthcare folks. We don't have epidemiology type backgrounds. We're not futurists, and we're not policy experts. So we're not trying to explain to you how COVID will unveil. What we are hoping to get done is certainly help provide some context and where we believe the world is moving relative retirement plans, both in regard to the three committees and areas of expertise, but also how we as an organization can change how we interact with clients to be more responsive to your needs in what I expect will be a very different environment post-pandemic than the one that we may have experienced a mere 15 months ago. So let me, for those who may not be familiar, and this is probably not true of many of our clients, right? You interact typically with one consultant within the organization. That's how you view Multnomah Group. I think it's probably useful to understand maybe a little bit of the broader context, because I think it's important to how we both deliver service and certainly how we expect to deliver consulting expertise to our clients going forward. As an organization, we work with about 125 clients, 123 currently across the country. We are fiduciaries to more than 29 billion in assets, covering about 200,000 Americans who rely on these plans for their retirement security. Those 123 clients are served by 8 primary consultant relationships, where they serve as the point person of delivering content, guidance, and expertise to our clients. And all of our policy work really comes from the 3 committees I mentioned previously. So while I periodically may present ideas as being my own, really anything that you've ever heard coming out of my mouth is probably something that was taught to me by Greg, David, or Haley relative to their areas of expertise and things that we've tried to institutionalize with our clients. As an organization that's been around largely in this format for the last 18 years, I think there's a few things that we have always believed are important and continue to guide how we interact with clients. And the first really is independence, which we view as being a critical component and why we are an employee-owned organization. It's been a very busy period of change, relative ownership structures, and how that impacts folks that are providing fiduciary guidance to clients. We think that the independence component of what we do is critical to how we view the market and how we provide guidance to clients. The committee governance piece is a big piece of this. We rely on debating, sharing ideas, debating best practices, and arriving at policies that are repeatable for our clients. And again, all three of our committee heads will talk about this as a portion of the presentation today. Quality control is a critical piece. Having additional bodies, analysts, and support personnel to help analyze and ensure that the data that we're providing our clients is accurate and actionable is important to how we view our relationship with our clients. And what we've really, maybe more so than anything else over the course of the last 15 months, is how integrated our approach is and how reliant we are upon one another. And there's a number of examples that may come up over the course of today's presentation, but certainly the CARES Act during the pandemic being one of the greatest, where the issues relative how clients would deal with CARES from a technical issue were impacted with how they would deal with issues from a vendor perspective, and had an impact really on how investment decisions would be made for clients. That integrated approach is important in how we deliver service, but also the integrated approach in how we rely on one another. One of the great benefits of the pandemic is I got to see far more clients, perhaps in ways that were more awkward and technologically reliant than previous periods. But in looking back over the course of my 2020, I got to be in more client meetings in 2020 than I had been in 2019. And that integrated approach and allowing us to share our best concepts and ideas with clients, I think, is an important part of how we see the world progressing as we go forward. It's been a period of great adaptation, and the degree to which we had to adapt is certainly not as significant as perhaps others, but it was kind of fascinating to look back over the 2020-2021 period. Specifically, Greg and I were in a client meeting in Colorado Springs on March the 10th. And in the midst of the meeting, the CFO was called away. And by the time the meeting was over, the university we were meeting with had canceled the school year and gone to remote and told the kids to pack their stuff and move out of the dorms. Things changed obviously pretty rapidly around that period of time. By the next day, we as an organization had decided to go to an entirely remote environment. We were well positioned to do that. We've always had remote employees. So thankfully, the systems were already in place to deal with that in an efficient manner without causing any disruption to our clients. 12 days later, the S&P was down 30% from peak to trough. Obviously, the grave concern about how the closing of institutions and the economy would impact economic growth and ultimately stock prices played itself out very, very rapidly in the early days of the pandemic. Only 4 days after that, the president had signed what I would argue, while not focused on retirement plans, may be one of the more material pieces of legislation impacting retirement plans. And I think Greg will talk a little bit about what that may mean for the retirement plan environment going forward. We're an organization, as an integrated organization that relies on being connected, that has multiple employee meetings a year where our folks get on planes and come to Portland for 2 or 3 days and do training and work and interact and build teams, and that connectivity tissue that's so important for an organization like ours. We had our last meeting, or our first meeting, April 1st, to try and understand the CARES Act and how we were going to interact with clients. Obviously a virtual meeting, one of what now have been relatively regular virtual meetings with our team. And we were already in the month of April spending a tremendous amount of time working with clients to determine how they should react to the options afforded by CARES as part of this period of time. it was a scary time, right? Just from a personal perspective with, parents who are older, and certainly worries about how it would impact my children and their education like everyone else. It was a busy time professionally, which I think ended up being in many ways a blessing, right? You could dive into an area where you could control. You could help clients make good decisions and help them interact with the plan and continue to operate the plan. One of the things that we did in that April 1st meeting is say, this is going to be a protracted period of time, and we need to be able to use this time to work on the issues that will help our clients survive this period. And by helping our clients, we will ultimately help our participants and hopefully put them in a position at the end of this pandemic, however long it may be, that they're in a better position than they were going in. And I think I'm very, very thankful for the works of the three committee heads and so many of the support folks at the firm who have invested time in that effort. I'm very happy with where we came out, and we'll talk a lot about some of those issues today. I think there's three primary lessons that we've learned in this 15-month period, and probably hundreds of sub-lessons that would go into that. I think maybe first and foremost is that we miss one another and we miss you all. While we've been doing these virtual meetings, I think all of us are highly, highly fatigued with looking at the small boxes and trying to read body language and looking at the various backgrounds, both real, imagined, and projected, that folks have chosen to use during the pandemic period. I certainly have missed our company meetings and being able to sit down and share stories and hear about family. We've been able to interact more electronically than we had previously because the pandemic certainly has afforded us more time, but not in the same ways perhaps that we had previously. I think the biggest one from our perspective is that the pandemic we viewed throughout this period as being an accelerant. I'm not sure that it's changed a tremendous amount. I do think it accelerated a number of trends that were already in place. I think increasing workforce flexibility was a trend that was in place, and obviously this has projected that forward probably a decade or more. I think the stresses on the time of senior personnel within organizations continues to be another area where we've seen this accelerate during the COVID pandemic. I think the reliance on technology, both to help inform participants, but also educate committees and communicate with one another, have all been accelerated dramatically during this period of time. And I think the need for us as an organization to be flexible on behalf of our clients, while certainly that's always been a hallmark of how we try and distinguish ourselves, what's being asked of us from a flexibility perspective, I think, has accelerated as well. Our ability to answer questions, be dynamic in between meetings, not just in meetings, I think has been a differentiator during this period. And the third, the pandemic certainly has been more than notable in and of itself. At the same time, we've been in this period of accelerated social change and understanding and awareness. I think we see that both on the retirement plan side, just these discussions about environmental, social, governance type investment strategies. But I think it's also afforded us as an opportunity as an organization to sit down and look at how we can have a role in creating a better future. And we'll talk a little bit about that today as well. As I mentioned earlier, from a policy perspective, and really at the heart of who we are as an organization are the three policy committees, the Investment Committee, the Vendor Services Committee, the Technical Services Committee. Those are the three areas where 90% of the work we do with clients, perhaps more, falls within the purview of one of these three committees. It's important to us from a consistency perspective that these committees exist. They provide this great opportunity for us to debate ideas. And one of the unique things that's happened during this pandemic is with more time associated with reviewing our procedures, our operations, and the impact on clients. we've been able to accelerate the work that we do with clients, I think, dramatically during this pandemic period. I thought it would be useful in today's presentation as we view what the market may look like going forward to give you a sense of what those three committees have been working on and what they may perceive as being the next set of challenges and issues that we'll need to wrestle as we come out of the pandemic. So with that, perhaps I'll start with David, you and the investment committee, and maybe some of the work that you all have been doing during this COVID period.
Great, thanks, Eric. As Eric mentioned, I think one of the things that he was very thoughtful about in that maybe first couple of weeks of the pandemic is challenging each of us, within the organization to find ways that we can be productive with the kind of the found time that we had because we weren't traveling, we weren't driving to committee meetings, so on and so forth. And to really, dive into the work. So one, it was provide you some a counterbalance to the news cycle, but also, really take advantage of a found opportunity. And so really appreciated that challenge up front. And so one of the things that our investment committee, which I lead, Eric sits on, there's a couple of others in our organization, there's 5 of us total that work on that committee, really tried to take a step back and say, if we have, some time, what is probably the biggest impact that we can make for our clients? And where we landed on is really taking another look at our investment menu construction process. We think that's one of the more challenging areas for committees because at the end of the day, we talk a lot about Fund A versus Fund B, but ultimately you're creating an investment menu that has to meet a very broad set of participant goals and objectives. And so we started with a review of kind of the research that's available by behavioral finance, as well as kind of practical views that we've seen over the years in how best to deploy investments to make sure that participants have the ability to diversify, but also make choices in a way that makes sense and is relatively straightforward for them. So we reviewed the available research. We defined our view, which is we think that simplicity and choice should be balanced. We think that costs are important. We ultimately think that how the committee views the investments is important, but it needs to be aligned with how it's communicated to participants to support that decision-making process. So as we work through those principles and then refreshed our consulting deck or support materials for client meetings, we also instituted a peer review or a consultant team review process late last year, where each of the kind of client-facing committee members, investment committee members, would partner up with another consultant within the firm and reviewed their clients' investment menus and challenged those existing positions to ensure that kind of our best ideas were making their way into portfolios. And so that was, I think, a real positive attempt to ensure, again, those best ideas and that we were challenging the status quo, which then set up, I think, ultimately some good discussions in the first quarter. Where we land from a research standpoint is there's 3 types of participants. We think that a tiered menu makes sense with the target date, low cost, core array and extended array, and then potentially those self-directed brokerage windows options from time to time. Eric, maybe on the next page, talk a little bit about the results of that. So as Eric mentioned, we have about 123 clients or so. What we found is that about a third of those clients through the Q1 and Q2 meeting cycles have engaged in fairly substantive changes to their investment menus. And again, we think that kind of falls back on that consultant peer review process as well as, kind of an update to the consulting materials. But also, while we had some additional time, what we found is that our committees, because you weren't running around maybe quite as much, we were able to schedule our normal meetings, but also hold maybe additional meetings to continue the conversation. Some of these conversations I found with my clients benefited by having pre-meetings as well as the regular committee meeting. And oh, we didn't get all the way through that, let's schedule a follow-up meeting. And there was time in many of these client committees schedules for those additional discussions. And so we really feel like we were able to move those conversations along a little more effectively than in a traditional environment. Noted here some kind of observations that we saw from this last quarter or two, with the additional ESG options being added to client plans, client fund lineups. That's certainly an area for many of our clients. It's very important within their organization that they then reflect that in their investment menus for their participants to choose. We saw quite a bit of consolidation within the investment offerings, so making sure that the funds were truly distinct from one another, and where funds weren't distinct, where there was quite a bit of overlap, many committees decided to consolidate those options to simplify participant choice. For a lot of our 403B clients, you may be in a situation where you have multiple vendors because of legacy arrangements. What the pandemic allowed is, again, for multiple conversations, we were able to look at ways to reduce the number of investment options, or reduce the amount of investments at certain vendors, and map those options to a single vendor, which ultimately leads to greater committee flexibility with regard to choice. You don't have issues that, one record keeper can use a certain set of funds and there's fees to use them at another vendor, and so on and so forth. So there's some flexibility that we saw by being able to have those additional conversations. We certainly saw some move to lower expenses as a result of consolidation and asset aggregation, particularly in those multi-vendor situations. And then the last one, I think, is still a work in progress. And there's a bit of an evolutionary component to it as well, which is that it's great that the committee sees the investments kind of shown there on the right-hand side in a very clean 3-tier approach. But a lot of times that communication to participants is more alpha order or risk return order, and maybe doesn't show the distinction between tier 2 and tier 3. And so that's something that we're continuing to work on with vendors, and ultimately helping committees align how they view the investments with how it's communicated to participants, so that it's ultimately a bit easier for participants to decide which type of investments they should be looking at.
David, forward, there's a few kind of issues that seem to be bubbling up. Maybe you can give me thoughts as to whether one or all are issues that ultimately the investment committee will have to wrestle here in the near term. Certainly one, the ESG option you've mentioned, we've seen kind of a flip-flopping of I don't want to say regulatory guidance, maybe prioritization of regulatory guidance would be the better way to categorize it. We certainly now are seeing more discussions about inflation relative, certainly the last 10 years. And third is, the notion of, with an aging population and more of that baby boom population hitting retirement, the differing needs of retirees and pre-retirees to accumulation folks. Can you talk a little bit about how the investment committee is maybe viewing those topics from a prioritization perspective, and where you see perhaps the environment changing?
Yeah, sure. I guess, taking them in order, the environmental social governance funds, I think we've have a history, a long history of being supportive of those types of investments. in our both in our client portfolios, but also in our research process. Ultimately, you're right. We did get some guidance or prioritization, I think is probably fair. Where we're at is those options are sticking in plans. We haven't seen clients, exit from those options. We are seeing, again, trying to communicate them to participants and kind of what they are, and making sure that participants understand what they're investing in. But also, I've noticed as I'm reviewing our investment analysts' profiles, which is our write-up of kind of the people, process, philosophy of each of the kind of strategies that we cover. I'm seeing more and more discussion of ESG as a component of actively managed investment strategies. So what we're seeing is the investment industry, and you turn on the TV or read anything, you're seeing this more and more from the top level organizations talking about their view of ESG and how they're integrating it into their investment process. So whether we have standalone ESG options or it just becomes a component of an actively managed strategy, we're seeing that more and more across the board, and you're going to see it more in our research as well. On inflation, it feels it feels an awful lot like a bit of a repeat of 07, 08, 09, and concerns about the expanding federal budget and its impact on inflation. We certainly are seeing, I think, a greater impact to the numbers relative to what we saw back during the Great Financial Crisis or Great Recession. A lot of that is potentially transitory in the sense that we've got, some not endpoint sensitivity, but beginning point sensitivity in the numbers that we're seeing in April, May, and likely in June, given the shutdown of the economy last year. I think ultimately there's there'll be a shakeout as to whether or not that's truly transitory, or if there's a longer term impact to inflation. And the investment committee is certainly monitoring that. Many of our clients will offer inflation sensitive options, whether it be real estate or inflation sensitive bonds in their portfolio. I don't see a mass rush to change investment menus as a result of the inflation numbers that we've seen the last couple of months, but certainly something that we'll stay on top of. And then last, and maybe I'll wrap up quickly so that we can get on to my colleagues' discussions. But retirement income, certainly with Secure Act, we've gotten a few more questions on that topic. We have a research project currently underway to review retirement income products, likely and primarily because many of our committee members or committees want to make sure that the retirement plan remains attractive to retirees. They want to keep those assets. A lot of committees want to keep those assets in the plan because it subsidizes costs for those active participants, making the plans more attractive to vendors. So certainly a product that we're looking at, recognizing that annuitization rates are relatively low, but certainly I think a trend for the future.
Thanks, David. Next, Haley, maybe as a prequel, there's been a lot of change. I think the expression is never let a crisis go to waste. I think, two of the largest providers in the marketplace have both engaged in, small scale to large scale voluntary separation programs as they've helped employees kind of maybe reduce their own headcounts during the pandemic. We had at least two other material providers who exited the business. Can you talk a little bit about what the Vendor Services Committee both has been working on and what they see going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it has been a pretty wild year for record keepers, and that has meant more acceleration. Like we've talked about, the pandemic continues to be an accelerant. So the consolidation that we were seeing amongst record keepers in the past has continued and continued. We've seen, as you mentioned, folks leave the market. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that keeping up with the requirements of record keeping requires a huge amount of investment in technology, especially this year. And in order to make that make business sense, you have to have a pretty large scale business to, throw those costs around. And the best way to get more scale is through consolidation and acquiring other companies. And so we've seen a big movement there. And that makes sense. So if you think back to March and April of last year, it was a real stress test for record keepers. They were dealing with both increases in participant engagement when the market dropped and volatility was up. People wanted reassurance and they were calling in to record keepers and they were going on the website and they had questions and concerns and they wanted someone to talk to. And so we saw a big increase in activity there. But at the same time, these huge financial institutions were trying to figure out how to conduct business remotely. And in a lot of those positions, especially the ones that interact with participants, those roles had never been remote because they relied on things like recorded phone lines and other security measures for fraud. And so we had to figure out how to continue to do this business in a remote environment while dealing with more and more activity. So a real stress test amongst these record keepers. And you really saw the difference in investment in technology that had been made over the past few years as some record keepers pivoted relatively easily and others struggled or took a little bit longer. And I think that our clients really started to see that. It's really easy to say that you have no complaints about your record keeper while things are good and easy and going as normal. But under this stress, I think some cracks started to appear. At the same time, just after that, the CARES Act was signed. And so now these record keepers are trying to figure out how to update their systems to allow for these provisions and figure out exactly what these provisions mean without much guidance. And so there were really quick turnarounds on the CARES Act, and the Vendor Services Committee spent a lot of time figuring out how these, 24 record keepers we work with were going to deal with these provisions and the deadlines that our clients had to make decisions about how their plan was going to run for the next year. So we spent, many, many hours talking with vendors, talking to each other, talking to clients, trying to figure out how to implement these CARES provisions. And with that, I think it very naturally came that because we were having more conversation with vendors, we realized we needed to increase our due diligence with these vendors. We wanted to have better discussions with them because we had the time. They weren't traveling. We weren't traveling. We could get together and talk through some of these issues that we've never really dug into before. And so we instituted a much larger annual request for information, and we sent it to a larger pool of vendors that we work with. And that has allowed us to really understand the philosophy and process behind the work that these vendors are doing. On the other side, that also allowed us to improve our vendor search work. We were able to have a stronger and more robust pre-qualification process so that we were not sending requests for proposals to 10 or 15 vendors at a time. We were sending them to maybe 5 that we thought were a better match to our clients. And so we were saving, the vendors' time, and we were certainly saving clients' time and allowing them to make better decisions with, less time and effort because there were fewer variables floating around there. And so while I think we saw fewer searches during 2020, we are seeing many, many more searches this year. A little bit of that is delayed searches because no one had any time to do it while they were figuring out how the pandemic was going to impact their business. But I think today we have 18 vendor searches either in process or about to kick off. So a big increase for us and for our clients, and the work that we've done to streamline that search process, pre-qualify those vendors, has allowed us to better do those searches in a more productive way for our clients. We were also able to, build a lot of resources for our clients to have better conversations about fee allocations, for example, and how the plan pays for record keeping. And we saw, 24 changes in that fee allocation over the last year as we were able to have better, more informative discussions with our clients. Looks like you're on mute, Eric.
Thanks, Haley. One of the things we saw this year was a lot of movement during our fee benchmarking process on client fees. And I think we're still tallying numbers, but savings to existing clients were well over $1.5 million a year. As we continue to see compression, part of it is obviously markets have grown and that provides the client a little more pricing pressure. Where do we see the vendor marketplace going as that record keeping number continues to get smaller and smaller for clients who are actively managing it?
Yeah, I think that this is sort of a self-fulfilling cycle because the fee compression means that the margins on this business continue to shrink, which means that in order to make any money, in record keeping, you have to have scale. And so you're going to see continued consolidation, which again drives down fees. And so it is a little bit of a spiral. And I don't know where the bottom is, but we clearly haven't hit it quite yet. But that has also meant as the consolidation continues and as the fee compression continues, those other ancillary revenue sources that we talk about over and over again, proprietary management, annuitization, cross-selling retail financial products, continue to be a bigger and bigger piece of the pie in these relationships and therefore need more monitoring. And so we have continued to emphasize that and continued to ask the tough questions of our record keeper partners so that we know exactly what's going on there and helping our clients complete their fiduciary duty to monitor for potential conflicts of interest.
Thanks, Haley. Greg, I feel like in some ways technical may have gotten the worst of this, right? You had right before the pandemic, you had Secure 1.0, and then you went directly into CARES, and now there's a myriad of competing and related regulatory and legislative potential updates for this particular Congress. Can you talk a little bit about what the Technical Services Committee has seen during this period?
Yeah, David mentioned at the beginning that Eric sort of challenged us to find ways to stay busy as we sort of moved into this non-travel different environment. The Technical Services Committee did not suffer from that problem because we had plenty of things to focus on. We started the year, talking with clients about the Secure Act, and the Secure Act was sort of deemed the most substantive retirement plan enhancements in over 10 years. The reality of that legislation was it did a couple important things that probably didn't impact a lot of existing plans. But it expanded the use of employers joining together to offer a plan. And it also had some new tax incentives for small employers. A couple things that probably were small enhancements, but may have an impact on retirement longer term. David mentioned some of the provisions around annuitization, some of the protections for employers to offer employees the opportunity to annuitize. And I think the other provision that will probably, I'm starting to hear more rumblings about the use of it, although it fell by the wayside when the pandemic started, is the opportunity to offer employees the ability to withdraw up to $5,000 for the birth or adoption of a child. I think that'll end up being a fairly common provision going forward. But the pandemic hit and pretty much nobody cared about what was in the Secure Act anymore. That became pretty clear. Congress acted swiftly to really what essentially opened up nationally the retirement system to virtually anybody. The provisions allowed for a waiver of the 10% tax on any early withdrawal penalties. And then it also impacted new and the payment of existing loans. So, but when I say it opened the national system, it's because the rules around what qualified as a coronavirus-related distribution were extremely lax. Employers were not required to do anything really to verify. All you really needed to do was raise your hand and say, hey, I've been negatively impacted, I need some money. As a practitioner for over 25 years in this field, not minimizing the need to help people financially in the midst of a pandemic. I think it was important that something be done. It was a little scary, though, to think of the entire national retirement system being opened up for access by virtually anyone. And, I didn't know exactly what was going to happen. And maybe we'll sort of focus on the bottom bullet here about the impact on retirement savings. First off, most employers did allow the withdrawals. And Haley, through the Vendor Services Committee, was quick to inform us all that many record keepers were opting employers into the provisions unless they officially opted out, which had a big impact. So employers who didn't take any action automatically adopted those provisions. But as far as some of the statistics of what was the impact on the retirement system, I'm pleased to say that it wasn't as bad as maybe I expected at the beginning. I was just concerned that people were going to see this as a free opportunity to go get some money out of their plan. But very few people took the full $100,000 withdrawal. Maybe only 4% of CARES Act or coronavirus withdrawals were for the full amount. Average withdrawals seem to be in the $10,000 to $15,000 range. And I did see some information from two of the largest record keepers that really only about 5% of participants ended up taking withdrawals. But, if you think about it, if someone's contributing $5,000 a year and took out $20,000, that's 4 full years of savings. So while the numbers might not seem that bad, I think it's important to keep in mind that individuals who did take this money out are going to be behind in their retirement savings, and it is going to have an impact on them. I think the other thing that we saw quite a bit of was employers reducing their employer contribution. And we did see reduction in deferral amounts. I should offset that bullet point, though. We also saw some people significantly increase their deferral amounts. As time went on in the pandemic, people really didn't have a whole lot to spend money on. And, certain, I guess, somewhat savvy individuals said, well, I'm going to pump all this money into my retirement plan. So in some cases, you might have seen the employer deferral negatively impacted, but you might have seen the employee deferral positively impacted as people put more money into the system. As far as our reaction as a technical services committee, we had to go to work quickly to help understand what these provisions were and provide education both to institutions and individuals on what it means. And so really the first month, the first 4 to 8 weeks, we completed 2 webinars. We were pumping out sample participant communications to share with employees, multiple blog posts, preparing fact sheets. So we were pretty busy at the beginning of this. It has slowed down a little bit, and I think some important things for employers to know, the CARES Act provisions have lapsed. So they're over with one exception. Well, I guess 2 exceptions. The one is you have to complete your plan amendment if you adopted the CARES Act provision by the last day of the plan year beginning in 2022. And then another provision that is still out there, one of the unique things about these withdrawals, these CARES Act withdrawals, if an employee wants to, they can pay the money back into the plan. So it is possible that over the next 3 years, you could have employees saying, hey, I took some money out, but I want to put it back in the plan. So I think those are some of the biggest things. Eric, you mentioned some of the proposed legislation, and there's certainly a Secure Act 2.0 out there and some other things happening. There is one piece that I found interesting. Clearly I have concerns about allowing too much access to retirement plan assets. But at the same time, I think we need a solution for emergency savings and some of the issues that people who are struggling. I did see one piece of proposed legislation that it hasn't gotten very far yet, but in concept, I liked it. The concept was you could have access to up to $1,000 of your retirement savings a year, but you can only access it again if you've repaid the $1,000. So that's sort of a first shot at trying to create some sort of a way for people to use their retirement savings to get through a difficult time without opening up the entire system. So I think ultimately we will end up seeing something like that. Eric, if you could. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, well, and this is one of the areas where I think I'm really proud of the work the committees did. If you look at that impact of the coronavirus piece and the 5% number, our consultants and the teams worked really hard to get in front of every single client and have a real legitimate conversation about what the benefits and consequences of enacting CARES was. And I think the result of that is a smaller percentage of our plans than was typical elected to add the provisions. Many needed to, right? Their workforces were impacted. People needed access to assets, and that was a reasonable way to accommodate it. Others were not. And I think that the judicious decision of some of them to delay, forestall, and not do it all, CARES actually helped preserve hundreds of thousands, millions likely of dollars in the qualified plans. And I think that's an important achievement.
Yeah, and then as far as, after we got through sort of educating everyone on the CARES Act, like I said, that was a pretty fast moving train. That happened in a couple months. Then things settled down and we did have an opportunity to sort of look at some of the different things. We've updated all of our templated governance documents, including investment policy statements and sample charters and things like that. But I think the most significant thing that we were able to focus on in the second half of the year was continuing to build out our fiduciary training program. And this was a project that had sort of been in flight for a few years. And one of the aspects that we wanted to really build out was the level 3 training pieces. These are typically 1 to 4 page sort of deep dives on a topic. And for me, I was really pleased. We introduced over 10 new topics into the level 3 communication. We'll send out a link to our fiduciary education program with the email following this. But if there are topics that you want a consultant to educate your committee on, we've got a lot more material than we had a year ago, and we're all eager to share it with you and your committees. So that's probably what I was most impressed with, what we were able to accomplish as a committee.
Thanks, Greg. I did want to circle back to our role as an organization and talk about that a little bit. I think David spoke to all the work that committees have been doing, looking at environmental issues, social issues, and governance issues, how those may interact with investments. Clients are certainly dealing with establishing, modifying, improving, refining DE&I policies, and making sure that they're operating organizations in a way that's consistent with not only the financial health of the organization, but the general health of the country. I think we acknowledge that we have a role to play in that as well, and we've done a lot of work over the course of this time to take a look at what is our role in creating a world that is respective of the natural world and minimizing our impact on it. How do we establish practices that enhance the relationships we have between one another? And last but not least is from a governance perspective, how do we ensure that the standards that we operate on are ones that we can feel good about and that our clients can feel good about? And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of how that has played itself out over the course of this period of time. If you look at the environmental side, look back at 2019, we printed 165,000 pieces of paper and covers and shipped them to the four corners of the universe. I looked at my 12-month travel during that period of time. I flew 160,000 miles in the 12 months immediately prior to that last trip home from Colorado Springs. We think that the environment has been one in which we can reduce that carbon impact, where our goal is to try and reduce our printing output by 50%, being more mindful about other methods to convey information and how much information needs to be conveyed in any given meeting. Our goal is to reduce our travel by 50%, and that has two related benefits. One certainly is the environmental impact. The second is all of the time that's lost is time that we're not able to interact with one another and our clients. And I think that does have an impact on how effective and how quickly we can help clients move. I think what was notable during this 15-month period is how much more we were able to accomplish despite the fact that so many of our clients were engaged in their own critical issues relative to their own business. So to be able to still move these, what are generally ancillary issues forward at a more rapid rate is a lesson we can learn. On the social side, we've always been an organization committed to the $15 an hour organizational minimum wage. And really that pertains mostly to our temp employees and others that work within the organization. For the last 3 years, we've certainly been very proud to be named by Investment News as a best place to work based on survey data from employees. But there's more that we need to do. I think one of the things that certainly we've become more engaged and aware of during the pandemic is how and what role we have to play in evaluating our own DE&I policies. So while we're not, as an organization, large enough to be required to comply with EEOC guidance, we're currently tracking and relaying our EEOC data to employees, to clients, and monitoring that. We think the first step for any organization is taking a look at the diversity of our workforce and ensuring that we have a benchmark base in which to improve from. Part of that is also the implementation of an annual internship program to create more opportunities for folks coming out of college to evaluate this as a potential employment opportunity. It's not, I have a kid going off to college. None of her friends are saying they're going to college to become retirement plan consultants. I think largely if we're going to get a more diverse workforce, we're likely going to do that because we're interacting with potential employees at a younger point in time. And the third, and I think one that's important, our organization is obviously an aggregation of close to 24 employees, each of which have issues that they're passionate about. And the implementation of employee gift matching programs so that our who are committed locally to issues that pertain to themselves, their family, and communities, that we can help magnify or amplify those contributions. And last is on the governance side. And the governance side, I think, is a huge piece, especially for an organization charged with providing fiduciary services, independent fiduciary services to, as I mentioned earlier, about 200,000 Americans. We have no external shareholders, which means we don't have anybody who's demanding dividend premiums for investing in our business. We adhere to the CFA Code of Ethics standards, which I think are among, if not the highest in the industry. And last is we're really committed to this committee-driven firm development as an opportunity to ensure that all of our clients get all of our best thinking, not just my best thinking relative David's or Greg's or Haley's. But we think there's more to do there. With all of the acquisitions of independent consulting firms, our commitment and dedication is to remain an independent firm. Part of doing that is work that we are currently engaged in to broaden our employee ownership pool. The good news is that the average age of shareholders is in their 40s currently, but to continue to perpetuate that, because magically they all get older every year, myself included, we need to broaden that pool and involve more people as part of that. The next is the development of a client forum to inform our strategic planning. We have some great ideas about where we think the world is moving. We need to test that against the needs of the employers that we service. One of the other things that we're working hard on is the planning process. I think what can happen to many committees frequently is a movement that is largely dedicated toward pedaling the bicycle, doing the things that are required of them to meet their fiduciary responsibilities. We think that the planning process that we're proposing engaging with clients in needs to be focused on where we want to get to from a growth and development perspective. We think that committees need to have a good understanding of who their employees and participants are, and as a result, what their needs may be. We think committees need to be focused on zero waste, and I think that's a two-edged sword. Certainly, one is not giving away participant money because it certainly impacts returns. But the second is knowing how busy folks are. How can we convey information to committees and allow them to act and be more proactive? We think that small incremental change is really what drives continuum. I don't think that the retirement system needs to be blown up and restated. I think that there are things that we can do on the record keeping side, on the investment side, on the technical side, on the design side to make these plans more efficient. We think it's really important that we empower our committees that we service to act. I think our best clients have active committees who have been empowered by their board to do what's right for participants. And I think that that's really critical. And last but not least is to be transparent. I think from an acceleration perspective, technology has necessitated that whatever you're doing, you should be comfortable with having it be transparent because it likely is whether you know it or not. So being really thoughtful about why you're making decisions and comfortable sharing those rationales with the people, the participants that they impact. One of the big changes that we view as being important to driving that continuous growth is modifications to our annual fiduciary program. The pandemic has allowed us to do a lot more intra-meeting work, in between meetings, getting together with committee planning. We want to institutionalize that planning process because we think it's critical to improving plan outcomes and benefiting participants. So we've really revised on a go-forward basis how we expect to interact with most of our clients. And spending a lot in that Q1 meeting individually with benefits groups and subcommittees to work on the organization issues. At most organizations, all members of the committee are not created equal. Ultimately, there is a much smaller group within organizations that is doing the planning work or the operations work. That 1Q meeting is likely going to be a much longer in-person engagement with clients where we're meeting both with the subcommittee, the benefits personnel, then rolling into a more thorough meeting with the full committee. That gives us the opportunity to borrow time from quarters 2, 3, and 4, reduce the number of tackling issues that we need to bring in front of committees, and give committees much more scheduling flexibility. These are meetings that could very easily be done remote, as I think many institutions, ours included, will be moving to an environment of hybrid working conditions where employees may be in the office some days, but not on other days. If that isn't managed going forward, it will become virtually impossible to get those hour-and-a-half and 2-hour blocks of time scheduled in person. By being able to shrink down those agendas, manage the issues that are part of that strategic plan that we've worked on early in the year, that'll allow us to those meetings, more easily convey them remotely when the needs dictate it, and deliver the information efficiently to clients. The last thing I want to say is how appreciative we are. As an organization over the course of the last 18 years, we've done a few things that are pretty consistent with what we think committees should be doing going forward. We've tried to get to know our employees and put them in a position where they can be effective and manage good outcomes for participants. We've been really trying to minimize waste within our organization so that we get you information effectively and efficiently. We've always believed in iterative change. We're While fundamentally we do exactly the same thing now that we did 18 years ago, we do it a lot more effectively because we've improved it day by day by day. We've always been an organization that empowers our 8 consultants to act and do what's right for clients. And we want to be as transparent as we can with all of you about how we think we can participate and advocate for you going forward. Last thing I wanted to say again is just convey our appreciation. While, as I mentioned before, we're not healthcare workers, we're not epidemiologists, part of what I think causes each of us to come to work every day and be passionate about too is those 200,000 employees and participants across the country have a wide variety of roles, but we're certainly proud to have been able to watch over and preserve and hopefully benefit the lives of employees of the 17 different healthcare institutions that are clients of ours across the country. 2 of our clients are 2 of the largest research organizations doing work on COVID treatments and vaccine developments. A third, an organization the largest in the country working on policies related to pandemic management. While those employees are no more important than the ones working in the retail sector or working in the manufacturing sector, it certainly gave us an area to focus on during a period of time that was challenging. So again, want to thank you for your participation today. We're really, really excited about how the changes that we've experienced over this 15 months creates a real springboard for us going forward. And we're eager to get back out and start working directly on these issues and continuing, frankly, so much of the work that's been successfully done over the course of the last year. So I ran a little long, which I apologize for. For those who've worked with me, I take great pride in usually getting out on the beat, and I didn't today. I will leave the Q&A open. I understand folks that have likely Zoom calls to rush off to, but be happy to take any questions that folks may have. Thanks so much, and have a great day.